All right, I think it's safe to say we could probably jump in and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for giving your time to attend this event. I'm very excited for it. My name is Savannah Smith, and I'm the Event and Systems Coordinator with Event Services here at VCU. I've had the honor and privilege of planning some women's history events this month with the OMSA office here at VCU, and this is one of them, Women of RVA. So just to introduce our speaker tonight, we have Mari Julienne, who earned her history degree at James Madison University and her master's in public history at the University of South Carolina. She has worked at the Library of Virginia since 1999. She primarily as an editor of the library's ongoing Dictionary of Virginia biography project. She edited Changing History, Virginia Women Through 4 Centuries, which was published by the library in 2013. And she was co-curator of the library's 2020 exhibition, We Demand Women's Suffrage in Virginia, and also the co-author of the Campaign for Women's Suffrage in Virginia, which is also from 2020 as well. So thank you so much, Mari, for donating your time to us and being willing to speak with us today about the women of Virginia.
Well, thank you to the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs for inviting me to be a part of Women's History Month programs at VCU. And when I started thinking about this presentation, I made a list of pretty much all the Richmond women I could think of working on the variety of projects at the Library of Virginia. And I came up with way too many to talk about in one presentation. So I thought I would highlight some of them by taking a virtual tour around Richmond and hopefully show how women's history is not something separate, which sometimes people seem to think, but is an integral part of the history of Richmond. Oops, that button doesn't want to work. Alrighty. So starting on VCU's campus, I hope that as some of you walk down Franklin Street, you notice the state historic marker outside the Crenshaw House. And this is one of the relatively few historic markers in Virginia about women. And when this was the home of Anne Clay Crenshaw in 1909, she hosted a meeting of about 24 women who founded the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. And these were white women from prominent families in the city, and most of them were involved in progressive era reform efforts that led them to demand women's voting rights as a way to achieve their goals of reform in public education, public health, labor laws, and other causes. And the founding president was Lila Mead Valentine, and she had long been active in increasing access to healthcare for poor residents of Richmond, and also led efforts to improve the city's public schools. And she described the fight for women's voting rights as a clarion call to the woman of today. It bids her to stand up and think for herself, which was not always a commonly held opinion early in the 20th century. And one of the other founders was Adele Clark. She was an artist and also a businesswoman who operated an art school. And VCU has a large collection of her papers documenting her decades of activism for women's rights. And in the 1920s, she organized suffrage rallies and went on speaking tours. The women often held their meetings in public places, and Adele Clark would set up her easel and begin to draw or paint to attract her audience. But these were women who were stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior for women. And in the end, even though they couldn't persuade the General Assembly to ratify the 19th Amendment, they did build a statewide organization with more than 140 chapters and 20,000 members. And they did succeed in turning the tide of anti-suffrage sentiment among the public in Virginia. Now, it's important to remember that these women were working primarily on behalf of white women, although Adele Clark later on in her life remarked that she wished that they had done more to work with African-American women in Virginia and in Richmond. Now, just across the street is the Grace E. Harris Leadership Institute. And when Grace Edmondson Harris applied to graduate school at the Richmond Professional Institute in 1954, she was denied admission because of her race, and the state of Virginia instead paid to send her to Boston University. She was later able to transfer back to RPI, where she earned her master's degree in social work in 1960. And she joined the faculty in 1967 as one of the first 3 Black faculty members hired at VCU. She became dean of the School of Social Work and eventually served as provost and vice president of academic affairs. And throughout her career, Grace Harris pushed back against discrimination. In the 1960s, she would refuse to hold conferences or meetings in venues where African-American members weren't welcome. And she had a profound impact on the development of VCU into a major public research university, expanding the social work program, increasing the diversity of faculty, building relationships between faculty and the community, and establishing VCU's first long-range strategic plan. And after she retired as provost, Grace Harris directed the Leadership Institute that was named for her in recognition of her commitment to serving the university as well as the public good. Now, this is actually a pretty crowded block for significant women. It's also the home of, was the home of Elizabeth Scott Bocock, who was an ardent preservationist. As she saw old buildings destroyed in Richmond, oftentimes for parking lots, she fought to preserve the city's architectural heritage. And she was an early advocate of the adaptive reuse of old buildings and urged the city council to save structures that were not only important, but could be put to good use. And she and her cousin, Mari Wingfield Scott, lobbied for a historic zoning ordinance that the city first adopted in Churchill in 1957. They both sometimes used their own money to purchase buildings that were threatened by bulldozers. And Mari Wingfield Scott also extensively documented the architectural history of Richmond and its neighborhoods. And she deplored the inequitable exploitation of housing space. And she criticized landlords who would let historic buildings deteriorate in working class white and Black neighborhoods. So without the efforts of both Elizabeth Bocock and Mari Wingfield Scott, the city of Richmond would look very different today. Now, also on Franklin Street is Congregation Beth Ahaba, and there were a number of fascinating women who worshiped there. Zipporah Mickelbacher Cohen was the longtime president of the Ladies Hebrew Benevolent Association, which later became known as Jewish Family Services. And early in the 20th century, she and the association helped settle recent Jewish immigrants in Richmond, providing them with financial assistance and food and heating fuel. And she also helped fund the Instructive Visiting Nurse Association, which provided healthcare for city residents who couldn't afford it. And later in the 20th century, Naomi Silverman Cohen was an outspoken advocate for women to get involved in politics in order to make Virginia a better place for their children. And during the 1920s, she headed an organization that lobbied for legislation of interest to women. And she was known for spending up to 13 hours each day at the Capitol when the General Assembly was in session. And in the 1930s, she became one of the Virginia Department of Labor's factory inspectors. Now, further west from campus is the Richmond Peace Education Center, and one of its founders in 1980 was Mari Hasegawa. Her family had immigrated to California when she was a child, and during World War II, they were forced into a Japanese internment camp. And her experiences there and the use of atomic bombs in her native Japan led her to join the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was a group that had was organized in World War I to eradicate the root causes of war. And Mari Hasegawa served as its president during the Vietnam War. And during this time, she and her family moved to Richmond, where she was an advocate for human rights and social justice locally and worldwide. She called for disarmament, new economic models to end the concentration of poverty, the protection of rights of women and Indigenous peoples, and the elimination of racism, which are all issues that still resonate today. And the Richmond Peace Education Center continues to work towards building an inclusive community in Richmond through workshops and youth programs and conflict resolution training. And not too far away from there is Thomas Jefferson High School. And in 1962, Daisy Jane Cooper Johnson was the first Black student to attend Thomas Jefferson. Now, this was 8 years after Brown v. Board of Education had outlawed school segregation, but Richmond still had segregated schools thanks to Virginia's policy of massive resistance. And after Jane Cooper had been denied admittance to the all-white elementary school that was 4 blocks from her house, as opposed to the 5 miles that she traveled to her all-black elementary school, her mother filed a lawsuit against the Pupil Placement Board in 1958. And it took 3 years, but in 1961, Jane Cooper was the first Black student at West Hampton Junior High, and in 1962, she was the first Black student at Thomas Jefferson High School. She faced taunts and harassment from students and teachers. She had teachers who accused her of plagiarism. There were times when she went to class that she described how boys would lock their arms and force her to walk under their arms while they also spit at her. But she persevered, graduated in 1966, and she later went on to work for the Virginia Department of Education. And you can actually see her oral history about desegregating Richmond schools, which is online as part of VCU's Civil Rights Archives. Oops. So back towards campus and Monroe Park is Pace Memorial United Methodist Church, which actually now is the Pace Center for Campus and Community Ministry. But this was where Beth Marshak and other women organized the Richmond Lesbian Feminists in 1975. Beth Marshak had grown up around Richmond, and she was a politically active student at the University of Richmond. And she was involved with a number of civil rights and women's rights organizations. And she's been a longtime advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment and LGBTQ rights. And the Richmond Lesbian Feminist Group still exists. For more than 40 years, it's provided a safe space for socializing and activism. And it's probably the oldest LGBTQ organization in Richmond. And Beth Marshak's oral history is part of the Virginia Feminist Oral History Project that's at the VCU archives, along with numerous others that were part of a book, Creating a Progressive Commonwealth by historian Megan Taylor Shockley, who wrote about the feminist activist in Virginia who created social change in the 20th century. Now, long before VCU existed, philanthropist Grace Arentz was active in the Oregon Hill neighborhood. And she was the niece of wealthy tobacco manufacturer Louis Ginter and used the multi-million-dollar fortune that she inherited from him to provide a variety of public services through St. Andrew's Church in Oregon Hill. At the time, poorer city residents often lacked running water, so Grace Arentz built a public bath nearby. She started the city's first free circulating library in 1899, and she also started a kindergarten at a time when very few children attended one. And its success persuaded her to fund St. Andrew's School, which was tuition-free and educated girls and boys in both trades and academic subjects and offered evening classes for working adults. She went on to donate funds and a city lot for the construction of a public school in Oregon Hill. And she also inherited an estate just north of Richmond, and she left that property to the city, and you might know it today as Louis Ginter Botanical Garden. So throughout her life, Grace Arentz was very careful about guarding her privacy, but her public works made a significant difference to Richmond. And then across Belvedere Street, just a few blocks away, is the Jefferson Hotel, which was the site for several conventions of the Equal Suffrage League in the 1910s. But in 1915, it was the site where a group of women who thought that the fight for women's voting rights wasn't moving quickly enough established the Virginia branch of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. And this later became the National Woman's Party, which still exists. And founding President Sophie Meredith was one of the suffragists who picketed at the White House in 1917 as a public protest to spur President Woodrow Wilson to support a women's suffrage amendment to the US Constitution. And while it's common now to see protests at the White House, the suffragists of the National Women's Party were the first group to start holding protests at the White House. And at 67 years old, Sophie Meredith was arrested for picketing. And many of the suffragists who were arrested went to jail, but she paid her fine because her children insisted that it was better to be a live suffragist than a dead one. So after the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, Sophie Meredith worked for the passage of an Equal Rights Amendment, which was first introduced in Congress in 1923. And you might remember in 2020, Virginia became the 38th state needed to ratify the ERA, although it has been caught up in a lawsuit, so it has not yet been certified. Now, going down Broad Street, the site of Thalheimer's department store. And just a few years ago, a state historic marker was installed at the site describing the February 1960 sit-in at the store's segregated restaurant. A couple hundred Virginia Union University students marched from campus to Thalheimer's, and 11 women and 23 men went inside. White patrons spit on the students and dumped hot coffee on them, and the 34 students were arrested for trespassing. And one of the leaders of this protest was Elizabeth Johnson Rice, who had grown up in Richmond and was then a biology student at Virginia Union, where she had already helped organize a chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Elizabeth Johnson went on to become a science teacher and has continued to be an advocate for social justice as founder of the Be Part of the Solution Foundation. And the students' protests were successful, and Thalheimer's desegregated its dining facilities by the end of 1960, which was actually a couple years before the Supreme Court ruling that segregating dining facilities was illegal. However, Thalheimer's continued to operate a men's-only soup bar for another decade. And in 1970, feminist activist Zelda Kinghoff Nordlinger led a group of women in holding a sit-in at the restaurant's counter to challenge gender discrimination. And this is what she called desexegrating gender-defined spaces. One man was so horrified that he told the local newspaper that you don't want women so equal that we have a unisex world, which was an all too common opinion in the 1970s. And still today. Zelda Nordlinger organized Richmond's chapter of the National Organization for Women and led protests against gender-specific want-ads in the newspapers and lobbied the General Assembly for legislative protection for victims of rape. And she later described being a feminist in Richmond as being an evangelist missionary in a house of ill repute. It's been damned hard. Now, across Broad Street to the north is Jackson Ward, which was the home to many women who pushed back against racial and gender discrimination. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with Maggie Lena Walker, the civil rights activist and businesswoman who was the first Black woman in the United States to charter and be president of a bank. But there were many other African-American women in Richmond striving to create a better city. And one of them is Rosa Dixon Bowser, who had been born into slavery. And she was about 15 years old at the end of the Civil War. And she took advantage of the opportunity to attend school. And in 1872, she became a teacher herself. And she helped organize the first statewide association for Black teachers. And as its president in the 1880s, she advocated higher salaries for teachers and as well as a variety of educational reforms. She was active in the women's club movement. She was a proponent for subsidized nursery schools for children of working women. And she established reading groups and classes in things like sewing and cooking to help women who are trapped in poverty to find better jobs. She attended the founding meeting of the National Association of Colored Women, which spoke out against segregation and lynching and favored voting rights for women. And in 1925, the first public library branch for African Americans in Richmond was named in her honor for her lifetime of community activism. Ora Brown Stokes moved to Richmond in 1902, when she married her husband, who was pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church on Lee Street. And they lived next door, although the house is no longer standing. And she poured her energy into helping the residents of Jackson Ward. In 1912, she founded the Richmond Neighborhood Association, which provided funding and staff for child daycare, supported a home for African-American working girls, distributed food, and trained girls in sewing to help them find employment. Ora Stokes wanted to study social work at the Richmond School of Social Economy, which later became part of VCU. But as was the case with Grace Harris, the school refused to admit her in 1917 because of her race. Ora Stokes later became Richmond's first female probation officer, for which the city did not pay her. She volunteered for 20 years in that role so that she could help Black women and girls who were trapped in the criminal justice system. Sarah Garland Boyd Jones was the first African-American woman to be licensed as a physician in Virginia. And she was a high school classmate of Maggie Walker and taught school after graduation, but she had dreams of becoming a doctor and earned her medical degree from Howard University in 1893, which was the year she passed the Virginia Medical Examining Board's exam. During the 1890s, she was one of only 3 female physicians in Richmond, and she was one of about half a dozen Black physicians in the city. In addition to her regular practice, she offered a 1-hour free daily clinic for women and children. And Dr. Jones was concerned about the lack of medical facilities for African Americans. So she and several other doctors established a hospital for Black patients who oftentimes had to travel out of state for advanced medical care. And after her untimely death at only age 39, the hospital was named for her. And its original location is now under Interstate 95, but the Bon Secours Center for Healthy Living in the east end of the city is named for Dr. Sarah Jones. And just to the east of Jackson Ward on Lee Street was the second pickle factory of Ellen Gertrude Tompkins Kidd. And as a young woman after the Civil War, she began making pickles from her great-grandmother's recipe. They won prizes at fairs and neighbors started buying them. And she formed the Pin Money Pickle Company about 1870. And the name comes from the phrase pin money, which is what women would call the money they earned from household work, like taking in sewing or selling extra eggs. Now, Ellen Kidd traveled across the United States and in Europe to expand her company's reach, and she landed a lucrative contract with the Pullman Company to supply her pickles for railroad dining cars. She was a savvy marketer. She required that her pickles be listed by brand name on restaurant menus so that people would always know they were eating her pickles. And in the 1920s, she was doing $500,000 of business each year, which made her one of Richmond's most successful businesswomen. So not too far away at East Clay and 11th Street, once stood the home of Elizabeth Ambler Carrington, which is now under one of the VCU hospital buildings. But when she was growing up before the Revolutionary War, the only way she received an education was because her father taught her at home. During the war, one of her friends was seduced by a French officer and left with an illegitimate child. And as a result of this experience, Elizabeth Carrington came to believe that women needed to be educated so that they could think for themselves and learn how to discern whether men in particular had their best interests at heart. And about 1805, she co-founded the Female Humane Association of Richmond to support and educate orphaned white girls who lacked the advantages that women like Carrington enjoyed. And at a time when women were rarely involved in public affairs, Elizabeth Carrington and the other women who managed the association were definitely pioneers. The association was one of the earliest such charitable organizations founded by women in Virginia, and it continues to operate more than 200 years later as the Memorial Foundation for Children. And just a block away is the White House of the Confederacy, which is primarily associated with Jefferson Davis, who lived there while serving as the only president of the rebellious Confederate States. But this is also where Mary Jane Richards Bowser Denman, who is generally known to history as Mary Bowser, sometimes operated as a spy during the Civil War. She was probably born enslaved, but she was sent to the Northern Free States for an education, and she spent time in Liberia, although she didn't like it, and came back to Richmond in 1860. And during the Civil War, Mary Richards Bowser was an agent with a network of Union spies in Richmond. Shortly after the war, she recounted to an audience in New York how she had gone to the mansion on at least one occasion under the pretense of picking up laundry. When she was left alone, she went to Jefferson Davis's office, where she went through drawers and cabinets, and he actually found her there and asked what she was doing. But because she was a Black enslaved woman, he assumed that she was not a threat and let her go on her way. She also reported entering the rebel Senate while it was in secret session and helping capture Confederate officers. And after the war, she became a teacher with the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the spy network that she was a part of was managed by Elizabeth Van Lew, who was the woman who had arranged for Mary Richards Bowser to attend school in the North. Van Lew had grown up in a slaveholding family, but she gradually embraced anti-slavery views. And when the Civil War broke out, she decided to stay in Richmond and support the United States. She came to the aid of Union Army officers in Libby Prison, even helping some escape. And Van Lew's home on East Gray Street became the center of an interracial network of spies in federal service. They used code names and invisible ink, and they carried messages hidden in their shoes and clothing to provide the US Army with information about Confederate troop movements and supplies. The Confederates investigated Van Lew for spying, but they decided that she was just a frail spinster lady who couldn't do anything to infirm the cause. But the chief of military intelligence for the Army of the Potomac described her as all that was left of the power of the US government in the city of Richmond. She was later rewarded by President U.S. Grant when he made her postmaster of Richmond in 1869. And while she held that office, she hired numerous African Americans as postal clerks and mail carriers. Now, not surprisingly, Richmonders had a very negative opinion of Elizabeth Van Lew, and shortly after she died, her mansion on Churchill was torn down and Bellevue School was built on the site. And one of her neighbors on Churchill was Anna Whitehead Boddicker. She was the wife of a local pharmacist, and after the Civil War developed an interest in women's rights. In 1870, she organized the first women's suffrage group in Virginia. She invited national suffrage leaders to speak in Richmond, including Susan B. Anthony. And in her own speeches, Anna Boddicker described women as the slave of man, whose task it is to make his dumplings and bear his children. A brighter life than this is to be the lot of the woman of the future. Anna Boddicker embraced Susan B. Anthony's strategy of attempting to vote based on the language of the 14th Amendment that had been recently ratified. And in 1871, Anna Boddicker went to her precinct to vote. When the election judges refused to accept her ballot, she insisted on placing a paper in the ballot box stating that by the Constitution of the United States, I, Mrs. A. Whitehead Boddicker, have a right to give my vote at this election, and in vindication of it, drop this note in the ballot box. Unfortunately, a couple of years later, her family had her committed to an asylum for what they described as erratic behavior. And after Anna Boddicker returned home in 1874, she never resumed her suffrage activity. Whoops, that went the wrong way. Ethel Madison Bailey Furman also lived on Churchill, and she was the daughter of a building contractor. and studied architecture privately in New York because there was no place for her to study in Virginia. And after she returned to Richmond in 1921, she began designing houses. And she worked in partnership with her father out of their home on Q Street. She also raised 3 children and held a variety of other jobs to supplement her family's income. As a Black woman during the age of Jim Crow, it wasn't always easy for her to practice as an architect. And as you can see in this photograph, which is from a conference in 1928 of African-American contractors at Hampton Institute, she was often the only woman in the room. She was forced to overcome racial and gender discrimination by having male contractors that she worked with submit her building plans to city officials. But throughout her long career, Ethel Bailey Furman designed an estimated 200 residences and churches in Central Virginia. And she was a staunch advocate for voting rights, and her many years of community activism led to the naming of a Churchill Park in her honor in 1985. So coming back west up Broad Street is the First African Baptist Church, which was one of the largest churches in Richmond, and actually probably one of the largest churches in Virginia before the Civil War. And thousands of enslaved free Black women and men worshiped there. One of them was Lucy Good Brooks. She was born into slavery, although she and her enslaved husband were fortunate in that their separate owners allowed them to live together. Her husband kept a livery stable, and he was eventually able to purchase his freedom as well as Lucy's. But to keep their children nearby after the man who owned them had died, and while her husband saved enough money to purchase their freedom, she had to find buyers who would be willing to let them stay in Richmond. She succeeded in finding men who bought 3 of her sons to work in tobacco factories while letting them live with their parents. But the person who bought her daughter and promised to let her stay in Richmond actually took her to Tennessee, and the family never saw her again. Having lost a child to the slave trade, Lucy Good Brooks understandably had a special concern for the plight of parentless children in the aftermath of the Civil War. She convinced her sewing circle and several churches to support an orphanage for the many children who found themselves alone in Richmond. The orphanage building was completed in 1871, and the General Assembly incorporated the Friends Asylum for Colored Orphans in 1872. And Lucy Brooks's orphanage operated for 50 years, and the Friends Association for Children still provides child development programs in Richmond today. Now, just up the street, across Broad Street, is the dominant landmark of Old City Hall. You might not associate it with women's history. Remember, City Hall officials didn't want to take Ethel Bailey Furman seriously as an architect. But this is where Maggie Walker and Ora Brown Stokes led a massive voter registration drive that enabled more than 2,000 Black women to register to vote in 1920. Virginia, like the other Southern states, made it very difficult for Black women to vote after the 19th Amendment was ratified. And actually, Virginia made it very difficult for pretty much anyone to register to vote, but especially Black women and men. It was a complicated process to register. First, you had to pay your poll tax and get a receipt at the treasurer's office. Then you had to take that receipt to the registrar's office and provide the required personal information about yourself. And you had to be able to do it from memory. If you were an African-American woman, if you were a white woman, you got the help of a printed form to fill out. Then you also had to answer whatever questions the registrar was free to ask to determine whether you were eligible to vote. So as you can imagine, white women were helped along through this process while Black women were not. So Ora Brown Stokes and Maggie Walker and others spent weeks helping prepare women to be successful. They even organized a system to alert women around Jackson Ward when to go to City Hall and register so that they wouldn't have to stand in the long lines all day. One afternoon, an officer of the city's electoral board had told Ora Stokes that the line was small, so there wouldn't be too many Black women to turn away that day. She informed him, "There's more to come. I've got them lined up in Jackson Ward waiting for the word." So there were thousands of women, as I said, who took up the challenge of registration. And about halfway through the process, there were so many Black women and white women mingling at City Hall that election officials segregated the Black women to the basement. Of course, the breathless headlines and articles about Black women registering in overwhelming numbers was intended to push even more white women to come out and register. Even though 2,410 Black women registered in Richmond, that was only about 13% of the eligible population, in contrast to 32% of eligible white women in Richmond who registered. But overall in Richmond, they were more successful than was the case in many other localities. And on the bottom line of this registration book here, you can actually see Maggie Walker's registration. And I actually, at the library, I can see City Hall from where I work. And so I often think about the lines of women standing there waiting to get the opportunity to vote for the first time. Now, next door is the General Assembly building. And this actually is a picture of the old building. There's a new one going up on the site. And this is where the Virginia Council on Indians would hold their meetings. And Mary Belvin Wade, who was a Monacan Indian working in a downtown law firm, found out about the meetings and started attending. And in 1995, the governor appointed her to the council. So along with the other council members, she helped spread the message that Virginia Indians wanted to get out that they had not disappeared from Virginia, despite attempts over the centuries to eliminate them. To that end, she and the council worked to establish November as American Indian Heritage Month in Virginia. And she also lobbied for a state law to eliminate the fee for Virginia Indians to correct inaccurate racial designations on their birth certificates. And this was a result of the Racial Integrity Act that had been passed by Virginia in 1924, which for decades forbade Virginia Indians from being identified as Indians on official documents. And her work was instrumental in countering the bureaucratic genocide of Virginia Indians. So I want to finish up at Capitol Square, which is probably considered a very male-dominated place, but women had been a part of activity at the Capitol long before they had the right to vote or hold office. Virginians of any gender, race, or class have been able to petition the General Assembly throughout its history, and women often did so in the 18th and 19th centuries. Judith Hope was one of these women. She had been born enslaved, and her father, who was a free Black barber in Richmond, wanted her to be freed. Her mother purchased her in order to free her, but because of an 1806 Virginia law that required emancipated slaves to leave the state or risk being re-enslaved, Judith Hope petitioned the General Assembly for permission to stay. Now in 1819, 1820, and in 1821, the General Assembly refused to grant her such permission. So she remained enslaved until her mother's will freed her in 1928, after which Judith Hope was able to secure permission to stay in Virginia from the Richmond Hustings Court. And there are hundreds of such petitions in the legislative petitions collection at the Library of Virginia. They're digitized and online, so you can see them all there. And if you're at the library, our current exhibition, Your Humble Petitioner, has some on display. Now, during the Civil War, Capitol Square was the setting for the Richmond Bread Riot. In the spring of 1863, Richmond residents were facing serious food shortages, and many families didn't make enough money to pay the high food prices. And a number of women had decided that they had had enough. Mary Jackson, who was a married mother of 4 children, who worked as a huckster in the city market, brought a group of women together to demand bread to feed their families. So on the morning of April 2nd, 1863, hundreds of women met at the Washington statue on Capitol Square. They marched to the governor's mansion, some of them carrying axes or pistols, knives, or bayonets, and they demanded bread or blood. And after one of the governor's aides refused to help, the women marched from Capitol Square down Main Street to Shaco Slip in the business district, where they liberated supplies of flour, rice, bacon, beef, and other goods from various shops and merchants. There was actually very little bloodshed. There was some property damage. And after the governor called out the public guard, the crowd largely dispersed. Mary Jackson was tried on a misdemeanor charge, but we don't know for sure what happened to her because so many court records were destroyed in the fire at the end of the war. And it's impossible to document all the women who organized and participated in the bread riot, but many of the women who are known to have participated were married, had children, and were middle class, and it was highly unusual for them to protest civil and military authorities in such a public way, especially during wartime. But the public visibility of Capitol Square is what makes it such an important place for public action. Early in the 20th century, suffragists held rallies at the Capitol. They also came to testify at legislative committee hearings about why women should have the right to vote. In 1920, the Virginia League of Women Voters was organized in the Senate chamber. Supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment later held marches and rallies on Capitol Square, as have supporters and opponents of women's reproductive rights. Women may not have always been welcomed in the halls of power, but they haven't let themselves be excluded. And in 2019, the Virginia Women's Monument was dedicated on Capitol Square. It's not quite complete. There's two statues coming, one of Maggie Walker and one of Dr. Sarah Jones, which hopefully will be added in May. And at a time when fewer than 10% of statues in this country feature women, Virginia was actually ahead of the game in creating a commission in 2010 to honor women. Although that was partly because M. Bowles Alsop, who died just a couple of years ago, I think, she basically shamed the General Assembly into creating this commission. But I wanted to close with the language from the act that created it. From the founding of the Commonwealth, the genius and creativity of women and their presence and contributions have been evident in every aspect of Virginia history and the life of the people of the Commonwealth. However, they have received little appreciation, recognition, or official acknowledgement. Therefore, it is resolved by the Senate, the House of Delegates concurring, that a commemorative commission to honor the contributions of the women of Virginia with a monument on the grounds of Capitol Square be established. Surveys have shown that most people consider history to be the white male political and military history they learned at school. And that things like women's history, African American history, Native American history, those are extras that might be nice to learn about, but they aren't really necessary. But by leaving out large parts of the population, we get left with a very incomplete story. So it's all part of our history. And I hope as you travel around Richmond, you will remember some of the remarkable women who have made a difference here. And that's all I have, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Mari. Yeah, I would love the remaining time. We don't have to go all the way until 6:30, obviously. I'd love the remaining time to be open for questions or comments or anything. I must say this is my favorite women's history event that I've seen this month. This was just awesome. You covered some amazing things and things I didn't even know existed in Richmond, and now I definitely will pay attention. So that's so awesome. If anyone else wants to comment or ask a question, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat.
And I really could have picked a whole different set of women to talk about, because there are so many who did, yes, amazing things. I didn't talk about Sadie Heath Cabinist, who founded the Instructive Visiting Nurse Association, and Cabinist Hall, which is part of VCU, is named for her.
Right. Yeah. And I didn't realize so many of the VCU buildings were affiliated with the Women of Richmond's history. That's just amazing to me. Let's see.
And yeah, and I mean, there's women like Mary Lumpkin, who actually there will be a talk at the Library of Virginia about her next month. She was enslaved by Robert Lumpkin, the slave trader. They had several children together. She inherited the Lumpkins jail site, and then she leased it to the school that later became Virginia Union University.
Wow.
Yeah, so if anybody's interested in her, definitely you can check the library's website for that program.
Awesome. Do you all have any other women's history kind of months, or not months, but events this month coming up? Or
This month we do not. Next month, another event during Garden Week is a presentation on the Garden Club Women of Virginia, who actually were more radical in some of their behavior than you would ever think that Garden Club members might be. I mean, they, a lot of people think about like beautification efforts, but they, they really pushed a lot of, pushed environmentalism and conservation and, keeping neighborhoods from, falling into disarray. And African-American women in Virginia were heavily involved with the Negro Garden Club of Virginia, and they actually, white garden clubs and black garden clubs work together on occasion, which is a whole fascinating story that I knew nothing about until this past year.
wow, that's amazing.
So that's another thing to keep an eye out for.
That's so amazing. Yeah, I definitely will keep an eye out for that. As far as like other things at the library, I guess as far as like artifacts and things, is that open to the public? Would there be artifacts that folks could come and look at, or what is that like?
Yes, we have an exhibition gallery on our first floor. Right now, our exhibition is Your Humble Petitioner, and it includes a number of the legislative petitions on a variety of topics. Probably at least half of them in the exhibition actually are women's petitions. You had to petition the assembly for any number of things, like if you wanted a divorce, you had to petition the assembly for one. Like Judith Hope and other enslaved men and women had to petition to stay in Virginia if they had been freed. There's petitions of a community that doesn't want unknown vendors coming in to sell things. They want a tax on them. But then you have other people who are in the entertainment business, so they write the assembly asking to be released from the entertainment tax they have to pay in all the localities. So there's all kinds of things in legislative petitions. And like I said, they are online, so you can search those and find all kinds of things. So yes, and that exhibition will be up until November.
Okay, great. I've actually never been to the Library of Virginia. I don't know about anyone else on this call, but I've never been, and I pass it every day on my way home from work. So I need to stop in and like take a look, because it just sounds amazing. And the content you provided us today was just awesome, and I could not get enough. So I really appreciate it. Did anyone else have anything to comment or questions for Mari before we head out? Okay, awesome. Well, this was a great event. Thank you so much for coming. The recording will be shared with those who registered. And yeah, this was
all right. Well, and definitely go and check out the Virginia Women's Monument on Capitol Square, especially later this summer when it is completely finished. I know it can be kind of an adventure right now getting to Capitol Square because of all the construction, but it's definitely worth it to go take a look.
Thank you so much, Mari. I really appreciate it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to email me. But yeah, Everyone have a great evening. Thank you so much again for coming, everyone.
All right, thank you.